Story 1. The Archivist's Recurring Dream. Nora Pemberton had learned to trust the silence of forgotten rooms. The basement archive of City Hall held 18,000 cubic feet of municipal records, and in 7 years of cataloging, she'd found beauty in the orderly decay. Manila folders soft as cloth, ink fading to sepia, the particular weight of paper that had absorbed decades of humidity. But when she found the filing cabinet with her employee number stamped on its face, installed in 1952 according to the maintenance log, she understood that some silences weren't empty. They were holding their breath. The archive stretched beneath City Hall in a maze of reinforced concrete and steel shelving installed during the Cold War, when basements were meant to survive things that could unmake cities. Nora descended the iron stairs each morning at 8, her footsteps echoing in the stairwell that smelled of industrial cleaning solution and the particular mustiness of processed wood pulp slowly returning to dust. The fluorescent lights hummed at a frequency she felt more than heard, a vibration that settled into her bones during the long hours she spent alone with the systematic glue of a city's bureaucratic memory. She was 34. Slight and careful in her movements, with hands permanently marked by paper cuts in various stages of healing. Her supervisor, Marcus, visited the basement once a month to review her progress reports, but otherwise she worked in solitude that had become companionable. The archive asked nothing of her except patience and attention to detail, qualities she possessed in abundance after a decade working in libraries and records management. Her previous position had been at the County Historical Society, a bright room with tall windows. But she'd found herself drawn to this windowless place where time moved differently, measured not in hours but in boxes processed, files reorganized, information rescued from entropy's patient work. The filing cabinet stood against the eastern wall, in a section she'd been avoiding because the shelving there required reinforcement before she could safely access the upper boxes. It was standard government issue, 4 drawers of olive drab metal, identical to 24 others in the room. But stamped on the brass plate above the top drawer was her employee identification number, 478832NP. She'd stared at it for 3 full minutes, her hand resting on the cool metal, before she allowed herself to open the first drawer. Inside were personnel files, her personnel files. Not just the current ones she knew existed in human resources 3 floors above, but files dating back 32 years, documenting a career she hadn't lived. There was her application for the archival position dated 7 years ago that matched her memory. But beneath it was a performance review from 15 years prior, praising her systematic approach to the 1970s Planning Commission records. Below that, a commendation from 1992 for her work reorganizing the city charter documents after the flood. The dates descended like a ladder into impossible years. And at the bottom of the first drawer, she found a black and white photograph paperclipped to a file from 1952. A woman in a cardigan and pencil skirt standing in this same basement, this same archive. Her face young but unmistakably Nora's own. She'd left the basement early that day, climbed the stairs to Marcus's office on the 3rd floor where natural light and the sounds of the functioning city felt like emerging from deep water. She'd said nothing about the cabinet. Instead, she'd asked about the archive's history, when it had been established, who had worked there before her. Marcus had consulted his computer, scrolling through employment records with the distracted efficiency of someone who found such questions mildly tedious. "You're the 14th archivist since the space was converted in 1950, he'd told her. "Average tenure is about 8 years. Most retire or transfer to other departments. The basement work isn't for everyone." He'd looked at her with something like concern. "Everything all right down there? I know it gets isolated." She'd assured him everything was fine, accepted his reminder about her quarterly psychological evaluation. standard for employees working extended periods in confined spaces, and returned to the basement. The cabinet was still there exactly as she'd left it, drawers closed, her employee number gleaming on its brass plate like an accusation or an invitation. That night, she'd dreamed she was filing documents in the archive, her hands moving with practiced efficiency through motions she'd performed thousands of times. But in the dream, the papers she filed were blank, and when she looked down at her fingers, they were stained with fresh ink, wet and dark as arterial blood. She'd woken at 3 in the morning, turned on her bedside lamp, and found her hands marked with ink. Not imagined, but real blue-black stains across her palms and fingertips, spelling out words in her own cramped handwriting. Thursday ends. The second drawer of the cabinet contained correspondence. Memos written in her handwriting, addressed to supervisors whose names she didn't recognize, discussing projects she had no memory of completing. There were budget requests, acquisition proposals, detailed plans for reorganizing entire sections of the archive according to classification systems she'd never studied. The paperwork was meticulous, professional, bearing her signature at the bottom of each page, a signature that evolved subtly over the years, matching the way her own handwriting had changed from her 20s to now, but continuing forward into versions of her signature she hadn't yet developed. She began arriving earlier, staying later, driven by a need to understand that had moved past curiosity into something more urgent. The archive's silence wrapped around her during those extended hours, and she noticed things she'd overlooked before. The wear patterns on the concrete floor didn't match current foot traffic. There were paths she never walked, routes between shelving units she never used, but the floor there was smooth with decades of passage. One evening, working past sunset, she'd found herself standing at the filing cabinet again, and realized she'd walked one of those paths without thinking, her feet following a route her conscious mind didn't know. The third drawer held resignation letters. 12 of them, each written in her handwriting, each dated, each giving different reasons for leaving the position. The dates were all in the future. The earliest was 6 months away, the latest 11 years. But positioned at the front of the drawer, paper-clipped with red plastic that looked brand new, was a letter dated for the coming Thursday. The prose was terse, professional, immediate resignation due to personal circumstances. Her signature at the bottom was exactly as she would write it now, and beneath the signature, in the same ink, a single line. I understand what this place requires. I can't give it anymore. She'd stood under the fluorescent lights, the letter trembling in her hands, and understood that she was reading her own future written in a past she hadn't lived. The archive existed in a loop, or time moved differently in these reinforced rooms, or she had been here before in ways that made linear chronology meaningless. The woman in the 1952 photograph wasn't her ancestor or a coincidence. It was her, had always been her, would always be her, cycling through the same 7 or 30 or 50 years, cataloging the same documents, discovering the same cabinet, writing the same resignation letters she would never send until the cycle demanded it. The fourth drawer wouldn't open. She tried every day for a week, but the lock held fast and there was no key in the small envelope taped to the cabinet's side where keys were usually stored. She'd considered forcing it, finding a crowbar or calling maintenance, but something in her resisted. The drawer would open when it needed to, or when she needed it to. The distinction was becoming unclear. The dreams intensified. Each night she filed papers in the archive, and each morning she woke with ink on her hands, words written in her sleep that she couldn't remember forming. The messages were fragments. Thursday ends. The cycle requires. You've been here before. The archive remembers what you forget. She'd tried sleeping with gloves on, but woke to find them removed, folded neatly on her nightstand, her hands stained anyway. She'd tried staying awake, but consciousness was negotiable after midnight, and she'd come to herself at her kitchen table, pen in hand, fresh ink drying on paper she didn't recall taking from the drawer. Marcus scheduled her quarterly evaluation for Wednesday. She sat in the third-floor office with its windows overlooking the street, traffic sounds filtering through glass, the psychologist asking standard questions about isolation, stress, sleep quality, mood. Nora answered carefully, honestly where honesty was safe. Yes, she slept well most nights. No, she didn't feel the isolation was affecting her mental health. Yes, she found the work fulfilling. The psychologist made notes, smiled in a way meant to be reassuring, and cleared her for another 3 months of basement work. "You're one of the better ones," the psychologist had said, closing her file. "Most archivists start showing strain after 5 years. You seem to thrive down there." She'd paused, then added something that might have been kindness or warning. "Just remember, the work will always be there. Don't let it consume you completely." On Wednesday evening, Nora stood in front of the filing cabinet for what she told herself was the last time. She'd made a decision, though she couldn't articulate exactly what she'd decided. The fourth drawer's lock clicked open under her hand without her even trying, as if it had been waiting for this specific moment, this precise convergence of intent and acceptance. Inside was a single document, newer than everything else, the paper still crisp and white. It was her employment contract. Not the one she'd signed 7 years ago, but an older version, the text slightly different, the letterhead an older design. The date was 1952. Her signature was at the bottom, young and careful, and beside it, a witness signature, the city clerk from that year, a name she recognized from the historical records. Below the signatures, a handwritten addendum in ink that had aged to brown. "The archive requires continuity. The archivist provides it, duration perpetual with periodic renewal." She understood then, not the mechanics of it, how time bent in this basement, how consciousness cycled through decades, how she could be both 34 and 82 and 26 simultaneously. But she understood the essentials. The archive needed someone, and she had agreed in 1952 or 2015 or some other moment that existed outside the sequence she thought of as her life. The resignation letters were real. She wrote them in every cycle, trying to break free. And in every cycle she filed them away and continued working, because the agreement wasn't one you could break through simple departure. Thursday morning she woke without ink on her hands. The silence in her apartment felt different, final, like the moment before a door closes for the last time. She dressed in her usual clothes, ate her usual breakfast, drove the usual route to City Hall. The basement stairs descended into familiar darkness. The fluorescent lights clicked on with their customary hum. The archive spread out before her in rows of documents waiting for her attention. The filing cabinet stood where it always had, all 4 drawers now hanging slightly open, empty except for the 1952 contract in the bottom drawer. She pulled out the Thursday resignation letter from her bag. She'd written it last night, she remembered now, sitting at her kitchen table while her conscious mind slept. The prose was exactly as she'd read it days ago. Her signature was exact. She filed it in the 3rd drawer, which accepted it smoothly, and then she closed all 4 drawers and heard the locks click into place. The cabinet's brass plate had changed. Where her employee number had been, there was now a name. Nora Pemberton, 1952, present. And beneath it, newly engraved, another number she didn't recognize yet but would eventually, in another 7 years or another 70, when someone else descended these stairs and found their own cabinet waiting. She turned to her workstation, logged into the database, and began processing the day's documents. The archive breathed around her in its familiar rhythm, patient and perpetual. She'd been here before, she would be here again. The cycle didn't require understanding, only acceptance, and she'd finally learned the difference. Story 2. What Grows in the Projection Booth. Samuel Chen had learned to love the particular silence of an empty theater, the way absence had its own acoustic signature. Velvet seats absorbing sound, the high ceiling creating a cathedral quality that made even breath feel reverent. The Orpheum was the last single-screen cinema in Millbrook, a mill town that had been dying politely for 30 years. And Samuel had been its sole projectionist for the last 14. He knew every creak in the booth's wooden floor, the exact temperature the arc lamp reached before the celluloid was properly threaded, the smell of hot metal and old film stock that meant everything was working as it should. But 3 weeks ago, a new scent had crept into the booth, something green and ancient, like river mud and growing things, and Samuel had started finding frames in his reels that he'd never spliced there. The booth perched 2 stories above the auditorium floor, reached by a narrow staircase that climbed the theater's eastern wall. Samuel's workspace was 12 feet by 8, packed with equipment that hadn't been updated since 1987. The 35mm projector, massive and warm as a living thing. The rewind bench where he repaired damaged film. Shelves of spare bulbs, lenses, and canisters of film stock ordered from specialty suppliers who charged premium prices for obsolete formats. The window that looked down into the theater was thick plexiglass, scratched and yellowed. But through it, Samuel could see all 347 seats, every aisle, the stage's faded curtain, the exit signs glowing red in the darkness. He was 52. Methodical in his habits, with hands that could thread film by touch alone and eyes permanently strained from years of watching light flicker through celluloid. His wife, Linda, had left 6 years ago, tired of the evening schedule and the smell of the booth that never quite washed out of his clothes. His daughter, Megan, was in college in Chicago, majoring in digital media, and found his devotion to analog film charmingly anachronistic. He tried explaining that film had a quality digital couldn't replicate, the slight imperfection in each frame, the way light passed through actual physical material to create the image. But she'd smiled in the way young people smile at old people's nostalgia, and he'd stopped trying to justify what felt to him like preservation of something essential. The Orpheum ran second-run films and classics, programming that appealed to the handful of residents who still cared about seeing movies in a theater instead of streaming them at home. Attendance averaged 20 people per showing, clustered in the middle sections, leaving the sides and front rows empty. Samuel had memorized the regulars: Mrs. Kowalski, who came every Tuesday, Mr. and Mrs. Patel, who occupied seats M14 and M15 for every showing. The teenagers who snuck to the back row, hoping Samuel couldn't see them from the booth. He could, always, but let them have their fumbling privacy. The frames had started appearing during a Tuesday screening of Casablanca, a print Samuel had shown dozens of times and knew intimately. He'd been monitoring the feed, watching the familiar images flicker across the screen. When a frame flashed that stopped his breath, the Orpheum's auditorium shot from his exact vantage point in the booth, showing the theater completely empty, every seat vacant, the exit signs glowing red exactly as they did now. The frame lasted a fraction of a second, easily mistaken for a splice error or his imagination, but Samuel had run the print backward, carefully, and found the frame embedded in the reel between Rick's Cafe and the airport scene. The celluloid was aged identically to the surrounding frames, the sprocket holes worn in the same pattern as if it had always been there, waiting for him to notice. He'd convinced himself it was a preservation error, something mixed in during restoration. But the next night, showing The Third Man, another frame appeared, the same shot of the empty theater from the booth window. But this time the seats weren't quite empty. In row G, barely visible, A figure sat in the darkness, facing forward, patient and still. Samuel had stopped the projector, rewound carefully, and examined the frame under his magnifying lamp. The figure was real, captured on film, wearing what looked like clothing from the 1950s, their face obscured by shadow and the resolution limits of the celluloid. The frame shouldn't exist. The film was a 1949 restoration from the Criterion Collection, professionally archived, and yet here was footage of his theater, inserted seamlessly into the print. He'd started checking all his films, running them through the rewind bench, examining every foot of celluloid under light. The frames appeared in all of them, randomly distributed. A frame in Vertigo, 2 frames in Double Indemnity, a sequence of 7 frames in Sunset Boulevard. Each showed the Orpheum's auditorium from the booth window, and in each, more figures appeared in the seats. By the end of the week, he'd counted 38 distinct figures distributed across the empty theater, all frozen in perfect stillness, all facing the screen where nothing was being projected. The smell in the booth intensified. Under the familiar heat of the projector and the chemical scent of film, something organic was growing. Samuel found the source behind the rewind bench, a patch of moss spreading across the concrete wall, impossibly green in the booth's artificial light, damp to the touch despite the room's heat and dryness. He'd scraped it away with a putty knife, but it returned overnight, larger and more intricate, growing in patterns that looked almost deliberate. Spirals and straight lines that suggested language or intention. Linda had called on Sunday. Their weekly check-in had become routine since the divorce, careful conversations about Megan and finances and the weather. But this time, Samuel had found himself asking her about the early years, when they'd first moved to Millbrook, when he'd taken the Orpheum job. "Do you remember me mentioning anything strange about the booth?" he'd asked, trying to sound casual. "Anything unusual in those first months?" There'd been a long pause, the kind that meant she was deciding what to say and what to leave unsaid. "You were obsessed," she'd finally said. "You barely came home. You'd spend entire nights up there even when there was no screening. You said you were maintaining the equipment, but..." Another pause. "You talked in your sleep, about the theater being full, about audiences you could see but I couldn't. I thought it was stress. You just left a good job in Pittsburgh to come to this dying town for a position that barely paid. I figured you were justifying the choice." He'd thanked her, ended the call, and sat in his living room trying to remember those early months. The memories were there, but they felt thin. Like film worn from too many projections, the images faded and unreliable. He remembered the excitement of running the Orpheum, the pride in maintaining the old equipment. But there were gaps, nights he couldn't account for, hours that should have been empty but felt heavy with something that had happened just outside his ability to recall. Thursday night's screening was Rear Window, and Samuel threaded the first reel with hands that trembled slightly despite decades of practice. The booth was warm, the projector's familiar hum filling the small space, but beneath it he heard something else. A sound like distant water moving or breath drawn through organic material. The moss had spread across most of the back wall now, and he could see it growing in real time if he watched long enough. Tiny fronds extending, the pattern becoming more complex, more deliberate. The audience that night was standard. 17 people scattered through the middle sections, Mrs. Kowalski in her usual spot, a couple he didn't recognize in row L. He started the projection and watched through the booth window as light flickered across the screen, as Hitchcock's vision played out in black and white celluloid passing through mechanisms that predated digital memory. The frames appeared 40 minutes into the film. Not occasional inserts anymore, but a sequence, dozens of frames forming a continuous shot that lasted nearly 2 seconds. Long enough to be undeniable, to breach the threshold between subliminal and perceived. The audience below didn't react. They saw only Rear Window, Hitchcock's thriller uninterrupted. But Samuel saw the Orpheum's auditorium shot from the booth, every seat now occupied by figures sitting in perfect stillness. The shot panned slowly across the rows, allowing him to see their faces. People in clothing from different eras, 1950s dresses and 1970s suits and 1990s casual wear, all watching something on the screen he couldn't see from this angle. The camera moved, and Samuel realized with cold certainty that this wasn't footage from some other screening, some historical record. This was now. This was Thursday night, and in row K, seat 8, he could see himself, a version of himself looking down from the booth window, watching this same film within the film, watching himself watching. He stopped the projector. The sudden silence in the booth was complete, broken only by the cooling metals ticking and that sound like water or breath. Below in the auditorium, he heard the audience react to the interruption. Murmurs of confusion, someone calling out, asking if everything was okay. But Samuel wasn't looking at them anymore. He was looking through the booth window at the seats, at the 17 people he'd counted, and he was seeing more than 17 figures in the darkness, sitting in rows that should have been empty, patient, and still, their faces turned toward the screen where no image played. He turned on the house lights. The auditorium blazed into visibility, every seat revealed in fluorescent brightness. The 17 patrons blinked and shifted, shielding their eyes. The rows were empty except for the living, breathing people who'd paid admission. But Samuel could still see them, the others overlaid on the empty seats like a double exposure. Present and not present, visible only in his peripheral vision or when he didn't look directly. Mrs. Kowalski approached the booth after he'd apologized over the intercom and restarted the film. She climbed the stairs slowly, knocked on the door with her careful, elderly precision. Samuel opened it to find her looking at him with something like recognition. "You're seeing them now, aren't you?" she said. Not a question, a confirmation. He'd nodded, unable to form words. "Gerald saw them too," she continued. Gerald had been the projectionist before Samuel, an old man who'd run the Orpheum for 40 years before retiring. He tried to tell people, but everyone thought the isolation had gotten to him. He'd worked alone up here so long, they said. Naturally, he'd start populating the theater with imaginary audiences. But they weren't imaginary, were they? They're the people who've always been watching who never left. "What are they?" Samuel had managed to ask. Mrs. Kowalski had smiled, sad and knowing. "The theater's real audience. We're just visiting, Mr. Chen. We come and go, buy our tickets, watch our films, leave, but they stay. They've been here since the Orpheum opened in 1932, and they'll be here long after the last screening ends. The theater isn't ours. We're performing for them, and you're the only one who can see them clearly because you're up here, separate, watching the watchers." She'd left him with that, descended the stairs, returned to her seat. Samuel had finished the screening in a daze, threading the reels with automatic precision while his conscious mind tried to process what she'd said. When the film ended and the living audience departed, he remained in the booth, watching through the window as the figures in the seats became clearer, more present, filling the theater completely. Every seat occupied, hundreds of faces turned toward the blank screen, waiting for the next showing. The next flicker of light through celluloid, patient as they'd been for 90 years. The moss had covered the entire back wall now, growing in intricate patterns that looked, when he squinted, like the architectural plans for the theater. Every seat mapped in green, every aisle represented. And at the center, where the booth would be on the diagram, a darker patch of growth that might have been a figure standing at the window, looking down at the endless audience below. Samuel understood then that Gerald had escaped only through retirement, through physically leaving the booth and never returning. But Samuel had nowhere else to go. The Orpheum was dying, attendance dwindling, the owners discussing closure at every board meeting. In another year, maybe two, the theater would close, the building sold or demolished. And on that day, Samuel would have to make a choice: leave the booth and join the living world, or stay and join the patient figures in the seats below, watching films that played only for them, projected by whoever next climbed these stairs and learned to see what had always been there. He threaded the next day's film, a Friday evening screening of The Maltese Falcon, and found frames of himself already embedded in the print, standing in the booth window, looking down at the full theater, his face peaceful and accepting, as if he'd made his decision and found comfort in it. The moss grew behind him, and the sound of breathing filled the small space. And Samuel realized he'd stopped distinguishing between the audience he could see and the audience that was really there, because the distinction had become meaningless. The theater was full. It had always been full. And he was exactly where he needed to be, keeping the light flickering, the celluloid moving, the show continuing for the watchers who would never leave. Story 3. The names the static carries. Judith Okafor had learned to hear patterns in silence, the way emptiness had its own voice during the long night shifts at the County Emergency Dispatch Center. In 12 years working these hours, she'd developed an almost supernatural ability to distinguish between the quality of quiet before a call came in, the dense stillness before domestic violence calls, the brittle silence before traffic accidents, the stretched, anxious pause before medical emergencies. But the silence that settled over her console at 2:47 a.m. on Tuesday was different. It felt liquid and deep, like submerged things waiting to surface. And when the call came through, the voice on the other end knew things it shouldn't. The dispatch center occupied a reinforced concrete building on the edge of Fairhaven, a rural county where 70,000 people were spread across 800 square miles of farmland, forest, and the remnants of mining country that had collapsed in the 1950s. Judith worked alone on the overnight shift, midnight to 8, seated at a console with 6 monitors and a communication system that linked her to police, fire, ambulance services across the county. The building had been constructed during the Cold War as part of the civil defense system, built to survive nearby strikes and retain that era's utilitarian aesthetic. Thick walls, small windows, fluorescent lighting that hummed constantly and made time feel negotiable. She was 46, methodical and calm in crises, with a voice that could cut through panic and guide people towards safety through the worst moments of their lives. She'd talked people through childbirth, talked suicidal callers away from edges literal and figurative, dispatched resources to accidents where every second mattered. The work had worn on her in ways she didn't discuss with her husband Marcus or her teenage sons Darnell and Isaiah. They knew she worked nights, knew the job was stressful, but she'd learned to compartmentalize, to leave the voices and emergencies in the dispatch center when she drove home through dawn light to sleep while the world was awake. The call that Tuesday appeared on her console as emergency, location pending, the automated system unable to pinpoint the origin. Not unusual in rural areas with spotty cell coverage, but the voice when she answered was clear. No static or distortion, speaking with the careful precision of someone who'd rehearsed what they needed to say. "There's been an accident on Millbrook Road," the caller said. Male voice, middle-aged, calm despite reporting an emergency. "Single vehicle. Driver still inside. You need to send someone quickly." Judith's training took over. "Sir, can you provide more details about your location on Millbrook Road? Are you injured? Is anyone else involved?" "Mile marker 7, northbound lane. I'm not injured, just passing through, but the driver..." A pause and then, "Judith, the driver is hurt badly. You need to hurry." She'd stopped breathing for a moment. Protocol forbade giving her name to callers. They weren't supposed to know who they were speaking to, shouldn't have access to that personal information. But she pushed past the breach and focused on the emergency. Sir, I need you to stay on the line. I'm dispatching units now. Can you see the driver? Are they responsive? She'd pulled up the map, located Millbrook Road, and that's when the first real wrongness hit her. Millbrook Road had been decommissioned in 1963, flooded when the county built Fairhaven Reservoir to serve the growing town. The road existed on her old maps, the historical overlays her system maintained for reference, but it had been underwater for 62 years, 30 feet down, asphalt and yellow lines covered by reservoir water that supplied drinking water to the entire region. "I'm at your console," the voice said, and Judith felt her skin go cold. "I can see you, Judith. You're wearing the blue cardigan your mother gave you last Christmas. You've got coffee in the white mug with the chip on the handle. Your monitors are showing Millbrook Road right now, and you're realizing something's wrong." She'd spun in her chair, looking at the empty dispatch center, the locked doors, the security camera showing the parking lot outside where only her car sat under the single light. The building was secure. She was alone, but the voice continued, describing her workspace with perfect accuracy, down to the post-it note stuck to her center monitor reminding her about Darnell's orthodontist appointment on Thursday. "Who is this?" she'd asked, abandoning protocol, her hand hovering over the button that would alert her supervisor to a priority situation. "I'm calling from the accident site, Judith. Millbrook Road, mile marker 7. You need to send help. The water's getting in through the windows, the driver's still breathing, but not for long." She'd traced the call then, using the system's GPS functionality that could pinpoint cell towers and triangulate locations. The result appeared on her screen in red text. Coordinates: 41.2847 degree N, 78.9632 degree W. Depth 32 feet, Fairhaven Reservoir. The call was originating from underwater, from the exact location where Millbrook Road would be if it still existed. Where mile marker 7 would be if you could walk down there through 32 feet of water and find the drowned highway still intact, still marked, still capable of having accidents. "This isn't possible," she'd said more to herself than the caller. "You're going to dispatch units anyway," the voice replied. "Because you're thorough, Judith. You're careful. You'll send someone to check the reservoir shore near those coordinates just to be sure, because what if you're wrong? What if this is some technical error and there really is someone hurt and you ignored it? You'll send them and they won't find anything, and you'll file a report about a prank call or a system malfunction. But you'll know. You've already felt it. The truth is heavier than water." The line had gone dead before she could respond, the sudden silence in her headset feeling absolute and final. She'd sat at her console, staring at her monitors, at the GPS coordinates pointing to a location deep underwater, and made the decision to dispatch anyway. She'd called it in as a possible hoax, but worth checking, sent a patrol unit to the shore access point nearest those coordinates. The deputies had found nothing, just dark water and the distant lights of houses on the far shore. The call came again. Wednesday night, same time, 2:47 a.m. Same voice, same impossible location, describing another accident on Millbrook Road. This time, the caller provided more details. 2 vehicles, head-on collision, both drivers deceased. "You should send the coroner. But you won't, will you, Judith? Because you've looked at the history. You know what happened here." She had looked, spent Tuesday daylight hours in the county records office, researching Millbrook Road's history before the flooding. The road had been notorious for accidents, 17 fatalities between 1955 and 1963, unusually high for a rural 2-lane highway. The reports described them as ordinary accidents: excessive speed, poor visibility, driver error. But reading them in sequence, Judith noticed a pattern. Every accident occurred near mile marker 7. Every call to emergency services was made by passing motorists who described the scene with eerie similarity, as if reading from a script. And in every case, by the time help arrived, the caller was gone, untraceable. leaving only the wreckage and the dead. Wednesday night's call lasted 11 minutes. The voice described the dispatch center's layout, mentioned equipment that had been decommissioned 5 years ago but that Judith remembered clearly, spoke about calls she'd handled that were in no public record, private moments of crisis that only she and the caller should have known. It spoke about her mother's death 3 years ago, the breast cancer that had taken her slowly, the nights Judith had spent in the hospital holding her hand while monitors beeped and nurses moved through dim corridors. Details no one should have had access to, rendered in that calm, rehearsed voice, while the GPS coordinates placed the caller 32 feet underwater. "You're wondering if you're losing your mind," the voice said toward the end. "If the night shifts have finally broken something essential. But you're not crazy, Judith. You're just finally hearing what's always been calling. The reservoir didn't erase Millbrook Road, it just put it somewhere you couldn't ignore anymore." Thursday night, she'd almost called in sick, had picked up her phone 3 times to text her supervisor that she had a migraine, food poisoning, anything to avoid driving to the dispatch center, and sitting at her console waiting for 2:47 a.m. But she'd gone anyway, unable to articulate exactly why, driven by something deeper than curiosity or duty. The call came precisely on time, and this time there was background noise, water rushing, metal groaning, and beneath it voices. Multiple voices overlapping, calling out street names and landmarks, reporting accidents in the practiced language of good citizens performing civic duty. Judith recognized the cadence, the phrases. They were dispatch calls, dozens of them playing simultaneously from the underwater location where Millbrook Road still existed in whatever space drowned things occupied. "Judith, you're going to receive a call in exactly 7 minutes," the main voice said, cutting through the others. "A real call, from a real emergency. County Road 14, mile marker 22. Single vehicle rollover, driver trapped, fire risk. You'll dispatch units and they'll save her, a 16-year-old girl named Sarah Conklin who'll grow up to be a paramedic because of what happens tonight. You'll do your job perfectly, like always." The background voices faded, leaving only the main speaker. "But you need to understand what you're hearing. The reservoir holds everything. All the accidents, all the calls, all the voices trying to report them. We're still there, Judith. Those of us who stopped on Millbrook Road and saw things we couldn't help. We called in, did our duty, and something caught us in that act. Held us in the moment of trying to help. The flooding didn't stop that. It just changed where we are." "What do you want?" Judith had asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "To be heard. To know someone's listening. You're the only one who can receive calls from here, Judith. Whatever makes you good at this job, the way you hear patterns in silence, the way you know what kind of call is coming before it arrives, it opens you to frequencies others can't access. You're hearing us because you're capable of it, and because the time is 2:47 when the walls between places get thin." 7 minutes later, the real call came. County Road 14, mile marker 22, exactly as predicted. Judith dispatched units, talked the caller through stabilizing the trapped driver, kept her voice calm and professional while her hands shook and her mind tried to process what knowing the future meant about the nature of the present. Sarah Conklin survived, pulled from the wreckage 11 minutes before the vehicle's battery sparked and the leaking fuel ignited. The paramedics said it was miraculous timing, perfect response time. Exactly the kind of coordinated emergency response that saved lives. Friday night, Judith arrived at the dispatch center with a recording device, a cheap digital recorder from the electronics store, which she set up beside her console. When 2:47 came and the call connected, she heard the voice again, and beneath it, clearer now that she'd learned to listen, the sound of water moving, of metal creaking. of headlights that still burned 32 feet down where Millbrook Road stretched through darkness in perfect preserved asphalt. "You can't record this," the voice said, not unkind. "The equipment will fail, or the file will be corrupted, or you'll hear only static when you play it back. The calls exist in the moment of happening, Judith. They're not for documentation. They're for action." "Then what am I supposed to do?" she'd asked the underwater voice, the impossible caller, the chorus of witnesses trapped in their civic duty. "Keep listening, keep answering. And when you receive a call from Millbrook Road about an accident that hasn't happened yet in the world above water, you'll dispatch anyway. You'll send units to the reservoir shore at the coordinates we provide, and they'll find what needs to be found. Bodies that were never recovered, evidence that was lost, truths that sank. We're showing you where to look, Judith. The reservoir remembers everything. You just have to be willing to hear it." The call ended, and Judith sat in the fluorescent silence of the dispatch center, staring at her monitors, at the map showing the reservoir's dark water. The recorder had captured nothing. Just as the voice had predicted, 7 minutes of static and her own voice speaking to emptiness. But she knew what she'd heard, knew it with the same certainty she felt before any call came in. That pattern recognition that made her exceptional at this impossible job. She thought about all the calls she'd take in the coming weeks, months, years. The real emergencies and the underwater voices, the living who needed help and the drowned witnesses still trying to give it. She thought about the reservoir holding everything beneath its surface, roads and houses and the residue of lives lived before the flooding, and understood that water was a kind of memory, preserving what it covered, waiting for someone capable of hearing to finally listen. The shift ended at 8 a.m. Judith drove home through dawn light, past the reservoir's shore where early fishermen were launching boats, and she wondered what they'd think if they knew what swam beneath them, what still burned and called and waited in the drowned dark. She would go home, sleep through the daylight hours, return tomorrow night to her console and her monitors and the calls that would come at 2:47 from coordinates that couldn't exist but did, had always existed, would always exist as long as someone was there to answer. The voices had found her because she could hear them, and now that she'd heard, she understood she'd been hearing them all along, in every pattern of silence, in every call that came through her console. The reservoir was speaking, and she was its only listener, its only connection to the world above water where emergencies still happened and people still needed saving, where dispatchers sat alone in reinforced rooms and answered calls from places that shouldn't be able to call but did, because someone had to witness what the water held. Someone had to keep listening long after the flooding. Someone had to know that drowned things never stopped trying to be heard. Story 4. The Tenant of Longer Leases. Aaron Voss had learned to read the residue of lives in empty apartments, the way absence left marks more telling than presence. In 8 years as a housing code inspector, he'd walked through hundreds of vacant units, checking for violations before new tenants moved in, and he'd developed a cataloger's eye for the traces people left behind. Carpet wear patterns showing where furniture had stood, paint discoloration marking removed pictures, the particular smell that lingers when someone has lived somewhere long enough for their existence to permeate the walls. But the apartment in the rent-controlled brownstone on Ashland Street contained residue of a life he recognized as his own, arranged in configurations he'd never lived, documenting 20 years of tenancy he had no memory of inhabiting. The brownstone stood in the Riverside District, a neighborhood of pre-war buildings scheduled for demolition to make way for waterfront development. The property management company had hired Aaron to do final inspections before the building's clearance, checking each of the 12 units for code violations that might complicate the legal proceedings. It was routine work, documentation for lawyers, the kind of assignment Aaron handled efficiently after years of practice. He was 39, thin and careful in his movements, with a clipboard and camera and tablet for filing reports in real time. He'd been married once briefly in his 20s and now lived alone in a studio apartment in the suburbs, a temporary arrangement that had become permanent through inertia rather than intention. The building super, an elderly man named Morris, had let Aaron in through the main entrance and provided master keys for the vacant units. 11 apartments were empty, already cleared and cleaned. The 12th, Unit 4C, was different. "Lease says Aaron Voss," Morris had said, checking his records. "Been here since 2003, rent controlled, paid up through last month. But I've never seen the tenant, not in the 7 years I've been here. Mail gets delivered to the box, utility bills get paid, but the apartment..." He'd shrugged, uncomfortable. "Well, you'll see." Aaron had climbed to the 4th floor, key in hand, telling himself the name was coincidence, a common enough combination of first and last name, nothing to warrant the unease settling in his chest. But when he unlocked 4C and stepped inside, he recognized everything. The apartment was small, a studio layout with a kitchen alcove and bathroom, maybe 400 square feet. But the furniture was arranged exactly as Aaron's childhood bedroom had been configured in the house in Cleveland where he'd lived from ages 8 to 18. The bed against the north wall, desk beneath the window, bookshelf in the corner creating a reading nook. The proportions were different. This was an adult space, not a child's room. But the spatial relationship between objects was identical, down to the angle of the desk lamp and the way the chair sat in relation to the bookshelf. He'd stood in the doorway for a full minute, his professional training warring with the visceral wrongness of seeing his childhood room recreated in an apartment he'd never entered before. Then he'd stepped inside, documenting with his camera as protocol required, moving through the space with increasing dread. The books on the shelf were ones he owned, or had owned, high school textbooks, paperback novels from his college years, reference books from his early career. But interspersed were volumes he didn't recognize, books on architecture and housing policy and urban planning, fields he'd considered studying but ultimately hadn't pursued. On the desk, a journal lay open, and when Aaron approached, he saw his handwriting, his precise, cramped script, filling pages dated across multiple years, entries describing a life of studying and work and quiet routine in this apartment. The entry, dated 3 weeks ago, read, "The building will be demolished soon, 20 years in this space, watching the neighborhood change, documenting its transformation. I've been a good tenant, paid rent, kept quiet, observed the building's slow decay from the inside. But I can't remember moving in. I can't remember choosing this place. There are days I think I've always been here, that the person I am outside these walls is the temporary arrangement. And this apartment is the permanent reality I keep forgetting to live in." Aaron had photographed every page, his hands shaking enough that some of the images came out blurred. The journal continued backward through years, chronicling a life that paralleled his own but diverged in key moments. This version of Aaron had stayed in Cleveland instead of moving to Chicago for college, had pursued housing policy instead of switching to inspection work, had remained in this apartment for 2 decades while the Aaron he thought of as himself lived elsewhere, unaware that another version of his life was being documented in this rent-controlled studio scheduled for demolition. The bathroom mirror held photographs tucked into the frame, pictures of himself at various ages, but the backgrounds were wrong. There was Aaron at 30 standing in front of this building, smiling at the camera. Aaron at 25 sitting at the desk in this apartment, surrounded by textbooks. Aaron at 18, younger than he remembered being, holding a lease agreement and keys, posing in the empty studio before furniture filled it. He'd taken all the photographs down, spread them across the kitchen counter, and tried to find evidence of manipulation. Photoshop artifacts, inconsistent lighting, any sign these were fabrications. But they were genuine, printed on actual photo paper, aged appropriately, showing him in clothes he didn't recognize but that fit his style, in situations he'd never experienced, but that felt disturbingly plausible, as if they were memories he'd forgotten rather than events that never occurred. The lease agreement was in the desk's top drawer, a standard rental contract dated October 2003. The signature at the bottom was his, executed with the slightly awkward flourish he'd used in his early 20s before settling into his current, more controlled signature. The document was notarized, countersigned by a property manager whose name appeared in the building's records. Legally binding and complete. Aaron had called Morris from the apartment, asked about the lease history, the rent payments, any complaints or issues with Unit 4C over the years. Morris had checked his predecessor's files, read back a 2-decade record of perfect tenancy. Rent paid automatically on the first of each month, never late, no maintenance requests, no noise complaints, no contact with management except the annual lease renewals signed and returned by mail. The tenant was invisible, ideal, as if the apartment was occupied by someone who wanted to exist there without requiring acknowledgement or interaction. "You want to meet him?" Morris had asked. "I can try calling the emergency contact number on file." Aaron had almost said yes, then realized the absurdity. "What's the number?" Morris had read it back. It was Aaron's cell phone, the number he'd had for the past 5 years. He'd left the building after completing the inspection report. 12 code violations documented, nothing severe, standard wear for an 80-year-old building scheduled for demolition. But he'd taken the journal and the photographs, packing them in his work bag with the sense that he was stealing evidence from a crime scene, though he couldn't articulate what crime had been committed or who the victim was. At home that evening, he'd spread everything across his kitchen table and tried to make sense of the timeline. The lease started in 2003 when Aaron was 22, the year he'd moved to Chicago for college. In this reality, he'd gone to Chicago, finished his degree in architecture, worked for a firm before switching to code inspection. But the journal described staying in Cleveland, attending community college, studying housing policy, working for the city's rental inspection department, living in Unit 4C while pursuing a career that was adjacent to his actual life but fundamentally different. The entries were detailed, describing days Aaron didn't remember living, colleagues he'd never met, projects he'd never worked on. But the voice was his, the patterns of thought, the concerns and observations, the particular way he processed information and described experience. This wasn't someone else's life poorly attributed to him. This was his consciousness, his perspective. Living a parallel existence in that apartment, documenting a version of himself that had made different choices at a crucial juncture and ended up in a different place, though the distance between the two lives was measured in blocks rather than different cities. The most recent entries in the journal were disturbing in their awareness. "I've started to suspect I'm not the original," one entry read. "That somewhere the primary version of me is living the life I was supposed to live. And I'm a kind of residue, a might-have-been that got trapped in physical form, occupying this space because the decision to move to Chicago or stay in Cleveland was so significant that both possibilities became real, and the universe had to accommodate both outcomes." Another entry dated a month ago. "The building will be demolished in weeks. I've lived here in perfect stasis, aging but not changing, going through motions of a life without actually affecting the world outside these walls. When the building comes down, what happens to me? Do I dissolve back into possibility, or do I become visible, forced to reconcile with the version of myself that chose differently?" Aaron had sat at his kitchen table until dawn, reading a journal that described his life from the inside of an apartment he'd never rented, written in his handwriting, documenting thoughts and feelings that were undeniably his own. And he'd realized that he had no memories of October 2003 that he trusted completely. The details of moving to Chicago were vague, the kind of manufactured memory that might be constructed after the fact rather than genuine recollection. He remembered the decision, the acceptance to the Chicago architecture program, the debate about leaving Cleveland, the ultimate choice to go. But the actual experience of moving, of settling into Chicago, of those first months in a new city were curiously absent, as if he'd skipped from the moment of decision directly to the settled reality of being a Chicago resident. He'd gone back to the brownstone the next day before work, using the key Morris had given him for the inspection. Unit 4C was exactly as he'd left it, unchanged, waiting. He'd sat at the desk, opened the journal to a fresh page, and without consciously deciding to do so, began writing. The handwriting matched perfectly. The words flowed in his natural style. He wrote about returning to the apartment, about finding evidence of a life he didn't remember living, about the profound vertigo of recognizing yourself in a place you've never been. And as he wrote, he felt a strange doubling, a sense that he was both the person writing and the person being written about, that the distinction between the Aaron who'd moved to Chicago and the Aaron who'd stayed in Cleveland was more permeable than geography should allow. He'd left after filling 3 pages, locked the apartment, gone to his actual job, conducted actual inspections in other buildings. But that evening he'd returned, and the evening after that. Each time he'd sit at the desk and write in the journal, documenting a life he was simultaneously living and discovering, as if the act of writing in that apartment was creating the memories of living there, or revealing memories that had always existed but that he'd been unable to access from his other life. The entries began to describe things he didn't consciously know, but that felt true. The neighbors in adjacent units, Mr. Kwan in 4B, a retired postal worker, the Delgado family in 4D, 3 generations in a 2-bedroom. The pattern of light through the window at different times of day, the sound of traffic on Ashland Street filtered through 80-year-old walls. Details that should have been invention but that he found when he checked were accurate, as if writing them made them real or made real things he'd always known but had forgotten knowing. The building's demolition date was set for the end of the month. Aaron had visited Unit 4C every evening, spending hours at the desk, writing in the journal, sleeping sometimes in the bed that was arranged like his childhood bedroom, waking in the early morning light with memories that belonged to both versions of himself, the one who left Cleveland and the one who stayed. The boundaries between the 2 lives were collapsing, or perhaps had never existed, and he was beginning to understand that the apartment wasn't a separate place but a kind of overflow, a space where the life he'd chosen not to live had continued anyway, running parallel until the moment of demolition forced a convergence. On the final evening before the building's clearance, Aaron had arrived to find Unit 4C's door already open. Inside, Morris was standing in the empty room, empty except for the journal on the desk. The furniture was gone, the photographs removed, no evidence of occupancy except that single notebook and the wear patterns on the floor showing where furniture had stood for 20 years. Leaseholder never came for their things, Morris said. Movers cleared it out this morning, put everything in storage, but they left this. He gestured to the journal. Figured you might want it since you were doing the inspection. Aaron had picked up the journal, felt its familiar weight, flipped to the final entry, dated that morning. The primary version will read this and understand or won't understand and will file it away as a curiosity, evidence of shared name and strange coincidence. But I know the truth. I'm not a separate person. I'm the part of Aaron Voss that couldn't leave, the attachment to Cleveland and the life that would have been if different choices had been made. The building's demolition will end this parallel occupancy, and I'll reintegrate into the primary consciousness, bringing with me the memories of the life lived here. He won't notice the difference, He'll just have new memories of an apartment he lived in for 20 years. Overlapping with the Chicago life, both equally real, both equally his. The human mind is capable of holding contradictions, of being in two places at once, of living multiple lives simultaneously if the circumstances are right and the walls between possibilities get thin enough. The apartment was never separate. It was always part of home, just in a room I forgot I had. Aaron had closed the journal, thanked Morris, left the building for the last time. And as he drove home through evening traffic, he realized he could remember both lives with equal clarity. The Chicago years and the Cleveland years, the architecture degree and the housing policy studies, the apartment in the suburbs and Unit 4C in the brownstone. The memories existed simultaneously, overlapping but not conflicting, as if he'd lived 2 decades twice in different cities but as the same person, and his mind had expanded to accommodate both timelines. The building was demolished 3 days later. Aaron didn't attend, but he felt it. A slight disorientation in the afternoon, as if something that had been running in the background of his consciousness suddenly resolved, integrated, became fully part of the foreground. He opened the journal that evening, intending to read through the entries one more time, but found the pages blank except for the final entry. The others had faded, or had never existed, or had transferred their content directly into his memory where it belonged, not as words on paper, but as lived experience. He lives now with both histories, the Aaron who left and the Aaron who stayed, occupying a single life that contains multitudes. Sometimes he drives past where the brownstone stood, sees the construction site for the new development, and remembers with perfect clarity the view from Unit 4C's window, the quality of light at different times of day, the sound of his neighbors through shared walls. The memories are real because they happened, and they happened because memory made them real. And the distinction doesn't matter anymore. He is both versions, always was, and the apartment was never separate, just a room in the house of himself he'd forgotten to visit until the threat of demolition forced him to remember that home contains more space than the architecture suggests. And a life can be lived in multiple locations simultaneously if you're willing to acknowledge that presence isn't the same as awareness, and that the tenet of longest standing is always the version of yourself you chose not to become, but who lived anyway, waiting for you to remember they were there. Story 5, Where the Vineyard Keeps Its Harvest. Claire Armitage had learned to trust the rhythms of viticulture, the way seasons and soil and careful attention produced fruit that held summer in its skin and released it months later as wine. Her family's vineyard had occupied 200 acres of glacial hillside for 3 generations, and in 36 years of working the vines, Claire had developed an almost meditative relationship with the patterns of growth, the precise timing of bud break, the careful arithmetic of canopy management, the art of knowing when fruit had reached the exact moment of ripeness before sugars peaked and acids declined. But this autumn, the grapes ripened wrong, their skins growing translucent and disturbingly thin, and when she cut them open during the harvest sampling, she found not seeds but teeth, small and perfect and arranged in rows like primary dentition waiting to emerge. The vineyard stretched across hills that rose from the glacial valley floor, terraced plots established by her great-grandfather in 1923 when he'd emigrated from Burgundy and found this precise combination of slope and soil that mimicked the homeland he'd left. The vines were old, some approaching a century, their trunks thick and twisted, roots extending deep into the rocky earth. Claire had inherited the operation from her father 8 years ago, after his heart gave out during harvest, and she'd continued his practices with religious fidelity. Organic cultivation, hand-picking, small batch fermentation in the stone cellar her great-grandfather had built into the hillside. She was 42, strong from physical labor with hands permanently stained by grape juice and dirt under her fingernails that never quite cleaned away. Her husband, David, taught chemistry at the community college and helped with harvest and bottling. But the vineyard was hers, had always been hers in the way land claims people who understand its particular demands. They had no children, a conscious choice made easier by the vineyard's need for constant attention, the way vines required the kind of devotion that didn't accommodate other dependencies. The first anomaly appeared in mid-September, 3 weeks before anticipated harvest. Claire had been conducting her daily walk through the blocks, checking sugar levels with her refractometer, tasting fruit to assess tannin development and flavor profile. The Pinot Noir in Block C, planted by her father in 1984, was approaching peak ripeness, the grapes achieving that particular translucent quality that indicated the right moment to pick. But when Claire examined them more closely, the skin seemed too thin, almost membrane-like, showing the flesh beneath with anatomical clarity. She'd picked a cluster, brought it to the stone house at the vineyard center, and examined it under the bright kitchen lights. The grapes were beautiful in a disturbing way. The skin so transparent she could see the seed structure inside, except they weren't seeds. They were small white objects, oblong and precisely formed, and when she'd steeled herself and cut one grape open with a paring knife, what rolled out onto her cutting board was unmistakably a tooth. A small one, a child's first molar, complete with root structure, surrounded by grape flesh that looked suddenly horrifyingly like gum tissue. She'd stood at her kitchen counter for a long time, staring at the tooth, the knife, the violated grape, trying to construct a rational explanation. Contamination seemed impossible. Teeth didn't spontaneously generate in fruit. Hallucination occurred to her, exhaustion or stress manifesting as sensory distortion. But the tooth was tangible, hard as enamel under her finger, and when she cut open another grape from the same cluster, she found another tooth, slightly different in size and shape, as if from a different mouth. David had returned from campus that evening to find Claire at the kitchen table, surrounded by opened grapes and extracted teeth, arranged in careful rows across a kitchen towel. He'd looked at the display, at his wife's face, and sat down without speaking. They'd examined the evidence together, counted the teeth, 23 from a single cluster, and tried to determine if they were real or merely tooth-shaped objects produced by some unknown biological process. "They're real," David had finally said, applying his chemist's analytical approach. "Enamel structure, dentin, pulp cavity. These are actual human teeth. Primary dentition based on size, ages probably ranging from 6 to 10 years old." He'd looked up at Claire. "What the hell is growing in your vineyard?" They'd returned to Block C that night with flashlights, examining the vines in the darkness while mosquitoes hummed and the September night carried the smell of ripening fruit. Every cluster in the block showed the same transformation. Grapes that had been normal a week ago now translucent, containing teeth instead of seeds. 200 vines in Block C, each carrying approximately 40 clusters, each cluster containing 20 to 30 grapes, each grape containing a tooth. The arithmetic was staggering, impossible, thousands of teeth hidden inside fruit that looked from a distance, like it was approaching perfect ripeness. Claire had walked the entire vineyard over the next 3 days, checking every block, documenting the progression of wrongness. Block C was the worst, but all the plots showed signs of the same transformation to varying degrees. The older vines seemed more affected, the century-old sections ripening fruit that was almost entirely translucent, while newer plantings retained mostly normal structure with only occasional anomalous grapes showing the teeth and membrane transformation. She'd called the Agricultural Extension Office, tried to describe the problem in language that didn't sound insane, asked if there were known diseases or pest issues that could cause unusual seed development. The specialist had been polite but baffled, suggested sending samples for analysis, warned that viral infections could produce strange morphological changes in fruit. Claire had sent cuttings and grape samples carefully selected to show the abnormality without revealing its full horror, and waited for results that arrived a week later. Inconclusive. The grapes showed no known pathogens, no viral or bacterial infection, no pest damage. The tissues were healthy, the sugar levels appropriate, the acid balance normal. The report didn't mention teeth, and Claire realized the samples she'd sent must have been normal by the time they reached the lab. Or whoever examined them had chosen to document what was possible and ignore what wasn't. The cellar had always been her great-grandfather's masterwork, carved into the hillside and reinforced with stone, maintaining perfect temperature and humidity for fermentation and aging. Claire descended the stone steps each day to check the barrels from previous vintages, the 2023 and 2024 wines aging in French oak, developing the complexity that time and wood imparted to grape juice transformed by yeast into something more essential. But the barrels had begun to pulse. She'd noticed it first as a subtle vibration felt through the hand when she'd checked the bung tightness on a 2023 Pinot Noir barrel. Then as a visible movement, the barrel staves expanding and contracting in a rhythm that suggested respiration, as if the barrel contained something alive, something breathing. She'd placed her ear against the wood and heard it clearly. A sound like lungs filling and emptying, slow and deep. The fermented wine inside moving in patterns that shouldn't be possible in a liquid sealed inside wood. Each barrel bore a brass plate, engraved with the vintage year and grape varietal. But additional plates had appeared on the older barrels, small brass rectangles affixed below the vintage information bearing names. Claire's family names, her great-grandfather's, her grandfather's, her father's. And on a barrel that shouldn't exist, aged and weathered as if it had been in the cellar for decades, a brass plate read, Claire Armitage, 2031, vintage. The barrel stood in the deepest section of the cellar, in a corner Claire rarely accessed because those racks held only empty barrels awaiting new wine. But this one was full, heavy with liquid, pulsing with that unsettling rhythm. The plate indicated a vintage 7 years in the future, and when Claire had crouched beside it, pressing her ear to the staves, she'd heard her own voice inside, muffled by wood and wine but unmistakable, speaking words she couldn't quite distinguish, as if she was drowning in the barrel, submerged in fermented grape juice, calling out from a future that hadn't arrived yet but had somehow already been captured and aged. She tried to open the barrel, remove the bung, and examine the contents, but it was sealed impossibly tight. The wood swollen as if the barrel had been underwater for years, the metal hoops rusted and immobile. David had helped her, applying leverage with crowbars, attempting to force the staves apart, but the barrel remained closed, pulsing, containing whatever version of Claire's future had been distilled and stored in this cellar outside time's normal flow. The vineyard had been in the family for 3 generations, but Claire realized she'd never questioned what that meant. What price the land extracted for the privilege of cultivation. Her great-grandfather had lasted 39 years before a stroke took him in the cellar, surrounded by barrels. Her grandfather had made it 34 years before cancer consumed him. Her father 32 years before his heart stopped during harvest. And now Claire, 36 years into her relationship with the vines, approaching some threshold that the land seemed to recognize even if she didn't. She'd begun researching the vineyard's history, going through family papers stored in the attic, looking for documentation of its establishment, records of its early years. She'd found her great-grandfather's journal written in French, detailing his first years in America. The entries described his discovery of the land, the glacial valley with its perfect terroir, the way the soil seemed to welcome the cuttings he'd brought from Burgundy. But later entries became more cryptic, describing dreams of the vine speaking, of the cellar deepening beyond its physical dimensions, of barrels that contained not just wine but time itself, aging not the fruit, but the vintners who tended it. One entry, translated with difficulty due to archaic phrasing, described a conversation with the previous landowner, a man who'd sold the property cheaply despite its obvious value. He warned me that the land requires tribute, that all who cultivate it are cultivated in turn, that the vineyard's roots extend not just into soil but into the cultivators themselves, drawing sustenance from their years, fermenting their time into something the land consumes. I thought him mad with age. Now, after 10 years here, I feel the roots inside me, and I understand that I am being ripened. And when I reach my perfect moment, the vineyard will harvest me as I harvest it. Claire had sat in the attic, surrounded by 3 generations of family history, and understood that the teeth in the grapes weren't contamination. They were the vineyard's harvest of children who'd never been born. The descendants Claire and her father and grandfather had never produced because the land consumed reproductive capacity, trading the potential of future generations for the perfect conditions that made the grapes exceptional. The vines were fertility, and fertility demanded sacrifice, and what they took wasn't just years but the possibility of continuity, leaving the vintners childless and increasingly hollow, becoming vessels for the vineyard's needs rather than humans with their own autonomous existence. The 2031 barrel with her name pulsed in the cellar like a heart or a womb, and Claire understood it contained not wine but her harvested self. The version of her that would exist 7 years from now when the vineyard decided she'd reached perfect ripeness. And it was time for her to be pressed and fermented and sealed in oak to age until the land was ready to consume what it had cultivated. Harvest began despite the teeth and the pulsing barrels and the knowledge that pressed against Claire's consciousness like fermentation pressure against a barrel bung. David brought workers from town, seasonal labor that had helped with harvest for years, and they picked the blocks in the usual sequence, filling bins with clusters that looked, to untrained eyes, perfect. Only Claire saw the translucence, felt the weight that was wrong, understood that what they harvested wasn't quite fruit anymore. The first pressing yielded juice that was red and normal, the teeth sinking to the bottom of the collection tanks like sediment. The workers joked about it, one calling out that she'd found her nephew's lost tooth in the must, laughing as she plucked it from the grape mass and tossed it aside. They didn't see what Claire saw, that there were thousands of teeth, that the vineyard floor was becoming carpeted with them, that they were harvesting not grapes but the calcified remains of children who'd never existed, extracted from fruit that had consumed the potential of generation and transformed it into perfect acidity and sugar balance. In the cellar, the barrels pulsed with increasing intensity, the rhythm accelerating as new juice was added to tanks as fermentation began and yeast transformed sugar into alcohol and carbon dioxide. Claire worked mechanically, following the procedure she'd performed for 36 years, but she felt absent from her body, as if her consciousness was already in the 2031 barrel, sealed in oak, aging outside time while her body continued the motions of winemaking. David found her at midnight in the cellar, standing in front of the barrel with her name, one hand pressed to the wood, feeling the pulse that matched her heartbeat. He'd wrapped his arms around her from behind, held her while she trembled, and asked the question she'd been avoiding. "Do we leave?" She'd wanted to say yes, wanted to walk away from the vineyard, let it fall to whoever would buy it next, escape the cycle that had consumed 3 generations. But she'd felt the roots inside her, the way the vines had grown through 36 years of cultivation, how they'd become inextricable from her nervous system, her vascular system, her sense of who she was. The vineyard was her, and she was the vineyard, and separation would be amputation of something more essential than limbs. "I can't," she'd said. "It's already inside me, has been since I was born, maybe before. The land doesn't just take us, it makes us from the beginning, grows us like it grows the vines, and by the time we understand what we are, it's too late to be anything else." The harvest finished in mid-October. The teeth were collected, thousands of them, and Claire buried them in the vineyard, returning to the soil what the soil had produced. The wine fermented in tanks, normal to all appearances, and after 2 weeks she transferred it to barrels for aging. The oak accepted the liquid, absorbed it into the wood, and began the slow alchemy that would transform it from grape juice to wine. But in the deepest section of the cellar, the 2031 barrel pulsed, and inside Claire heard her voice, clearer now, speaking from the future it contained. 7 more years. Then the vineyard takes its harvest, and I become what I've always been becoming. Not the vintner, but the wine, not the cultivator, but the cultivated. The land makes what it needs, and it needed us, all of us, 3 generations grown like vines and tended carefully until we reached the perfect moment to be pressed and fermented and sealed away. Our years aged in oak, our time consumed by whatever drinks from these barrels when the aging is complete. Claire climbed the stone steps out of the cellar, emerged into the autumn afternoon, walked through the vineyard where the vines stood in their neat rows, already dormant for winter, their leaves fallen, their fruit harvested. She knew she would return next spring, would prune and train and tend them, would guide another year's growth toward another harvest. The cycle was absolute, and she was part of it, had always been part of it, and the 7 years remaining until the barrel with her name finished aging felt both impossibly long and terrifyingly short, time measured not in seasons but in the steady pulse of oak containing what she would become when the vineyard decided she was ready. The land stretched around her, 200 acres of careful cultivation, beautiful and terrible, holding in its soil the residue of everyone who'd worked it, their years fermented and consumed, their time transformed into terroir. And Claire understood that this was what made the wine exceptional, what critics praised when they described the vineyard's unique character, the ineffable quality that came from soil and sun and the vintners who gave everything, including themselves, to the land that demanded nothing less than complete harvest.